Alone is not empty. You learned to govern your emotions. The internal noise died down. The automatic reactions stopped controlling you. And now that the silence has arrived, you discovered something you didn't expect. That the silence terrifies you more than the chaos ever did. There's something nobody warned you about: emotional mastery. Something that shows up when the internal storms calm down, and that hits you with a force you never anticipated, because you were so busy fighting the noise that you never prepared for what comes when the noise finally stops. The silence. Not external silence. Not the silence of an empty room or a quiet night. Internal silence. That space that opens up when your emotions stop screaming, when automatic reactions stop consuming all your attention, when the internal drama that kept you perpetually busy fades to a manageable murmur. In that space, in that silence that emotional mastery creates, you come face to face with something you've been avoiding your entire life. You come face to face with yourself, and you discover you have no idea what to do with that. You discover you don't have the slightest clue how to be with yourself without distractions, without noise, without something to fill the space, without a screen to stare at, without a message to answer, without someone to talk to, without an urgent task to handle, without any of the crutches you've been using for decades to avoid this exact moment, the moment of being alone, with you, no way out. And in that moment, instead of staying, you run, you grab your phone, you put on music, you call someone, you turn on the TV, you reach for anything, whatever it takes, to break the silence and save you from the unbearable experience of your own company. Because the truth you don't want to admit is this: you can't stand yourself. You don't know how to be with you without feeling a discomfort that borders on panic. You don't know how to sit in the silence without feeling like something is wrong, like something is missing, like you need to fill that void immediately, or something terrible is going to happen. What you're feeling isn't loneliness, it's addiction to noise, it's dependence on distraction. It's the inability cultivated over an entire lifetime in a society that is terrified of silence and that has trained you since childhood to fill every second with something, anything. As long as the silence doesn't show up to be present with yourself without needing something external to complete you, entertain you, or distract you from who you are when nobody's watching, nobody's listening, and nobody's validating you. Think about how long you can go without your phone, without any screen, without any external stimulus. Just you, sitting in a room, in silence, doing nothing. How long do you last before the discomfort becomes unbearable? 5 minutes? 3? 30 seconds before your hand automatically reaches for the phone like a reflex you don't even control? That's the measure of your dependence. That's the measure of how much you've been running from yourself. And that measure, if you're honest, should concern you deeply. Because a person who can't spend 5 minutes with themselves without reaching for a distraction is a person who doesn't know themselves, who can't tolerate themselves, who needs the noise of the outside world to drown out something that's echoing inside and that they'd rather not hear. And that inability is costing you everything. It's costing you more than you can imagine, because it affects every dimension of your existence in ways you've probably never connected to your inability to be alone. It's costing you relationships because you cling to people, not because you genuinely love them, but because you need someone, anyone, to fill the space you can't stand empty. Because the alternative, being alone with yourself, feels more terrifying than being in bad company, than being in a relationship that drains you, than being surrounded by people who bring nothing real to your life, but who at least make enough noise so you don't have to hear yourself. It's costing you self-knowledge, because the only way to truly know yourself, without filters, without performances, without the edited version you present to the world, is in silence. and you run from silence like it's a contagious disease. It's costing you peace because you keep searching outside for what can only be found inside. And every time you search outside and don't find it, because it can't be found outside, the anxiety ticks up another notch, and the search becomes more desperate, more frantic, and more empty. It's costing you freedom, because a person who can't be alone is a person chained to the need for company and the dependence on others to feel complete, to feel okay, to feel alive, is the most invisible, most resilient, and hardest chain to break that exists. Because you don't even see it as a chain, you see it as normal. The Stoics understood over 2,000 years ago what you need to understand today with urgency. That chosen solitude is not a punishment. It's not a sign that something is wrong with you. It's not what society has taught you to believe, that being alone means being rejected, being inadequate, being someone nobody wants around. That's the propaganda of a culture that needs permanently dissatisfied consumers searching outside for what can only be found inside. Chosen solitude is a tool. It's the most powerful tool that exists for building a complete human being. It's the laboratory where the person is forged who cannot be forged in company, because in company there's always interference, always noise, always an audience in front of which you perform instead of simply being. It's the space where you hear yourself without interference, where you know yourself without performances, where you build yourself without the constant pressure of other people's expectations. It's the most powerful place you can access as a human being, and it is, ironically, the place you've been running from your entire life. Seneca withdrew voluntarily from the world with a frequency that his contemporaries sometimes didn't understand, not because he hated people, because he loved his own mental clarity and knew, from direct and repeated experience, that the crowd corrupts it. That every hour spent in social noise is an hour where other people's opinions seep into your mind without permission, where other people's priorities contaminate yours, where the pressure to conform dilutes the clarity that only silence can give you. He withdrew so he could return stronger, clearer, more in command of himself. Marcus Aurelius wrote the most profound reflections in the history of Western philosophy in the solitude of a military tent, surrounded by death and war, but at peace with himself. He didn't have Wi-Fi. He didn't have social media. He didn't have any of the distractions you use as an excuse not to be alone. He had a candle, a notebook, and his own mind. And that was enough to produce one of the most important works in the history of human thought. Because solitude doesn't empty you, it fills you with yourself. And if you're someone worth knowing, and you are then being filled with yourself, shouldn't terrify you, it should excite you. Epictetus, who was a slave for years and who lived much of his life in a poverty most people would consider unbearable, discovered in the forced solitude of his condition a freedom that many men surrounded by people and privilege never find. The freedom of being his own sufficient company, the freedom of not needing anything external to feel complete. The freedom that comes when you discover that everything you've been searching for outside is already inside, waiting for you to get quiet enough to hear it. None of these men saw solitude as something to avoid. They saw it as something to actively seek, as a deliberate practice, as a discipline cultivated with the same seriousness as physical strength or intellectual ability, as a source of personal power that the person who can't be alone will never know because they'll never stop long enough to discover it. Welcome to episode 8 of From Lost to Unstoppable. This is Stoicism for Winners, and this is the episode where you learn that being alone is not being empty. It's being full of the only person you truly need to live a complete life, yourself. If this episode transforms your relationship with solitude, leave this phrase in the comments: Today, I choose to be with myself. Today, you're going to learn to inhabit the silence that has always haunted you, to turn solitude from enemy into ally, to discover that the place you always ran from, that empty, terrifying place you avoided with every distraction available, is exactly the place where you'll find what you've always been searching for outside without ever finding it. First Stoic lesson. You're so afraid of silence that you fill every moment with noise, distractions, and people who bring you nothing just so you don't have to be with yourself. Let's take an inventory of your typical day. Not the day you'd like to have, the day you actually live. You wake up. Before your eyes are fully open, before your brain has had a single second of full awareness, your hand is already reaching for your phone. It's automatic. It's a reflex so deeply wired that it doesn't require a decision. The first thing you do every single day of your life isn't to breathe consciously. It isn't to be grateful you're alive. It isn't to think about what kind of day you want to build. The first thing you do is flood your mind with the thoughts, the news, the opinions, and the problems of other people. Notifications, messages, social media, news, the entire world pouring into your head before you've had a single instant of real contact with yourself. Then the day continues, and the day is an unbroken sequence of noise. Noise in the car on the way to work, music, podcasts, radio, anything to prevent the silence from appearing during those minutes that could have been yours. Noise at the office, conversations, meetings, the constant hum of an environment that never shuts up. Noise at lunch. You eat, staring at a screen or talking to someone, never alone, never in silence, never with the simple experience of being present with your food and your thoughts. Noise on the way home. More music, more podcasts, more calls. Noise at night. Television, phone, the constant presence of some stimulus to keep you company until sleep rescues you from the only moment of the day when silence threatened to appear. At what point during that day were you with yourself? At what point was there real silence? At what point did your mind have space to process what it feels, what it thinks, what it wants, what it needs, without the interference of 1,000 other voices competing for your attention? The answer is at no point. Not a single instant of the day was truly yours. Every second was occupied by something external. Every moment of potential silence was preemptively filled with noise, as if silence were a dangerous hole that needs to be plugged before something rises from the bottom. And what rises from the bottom, what the noise is so carefully covering up, is precisely what you most need to hear. It's the questions you've been avoiding for years. The questions that noise suffocates every time they try to surface. Am I living the life I actually want, or the life that assembled itself by default while I was distracted? Is this relationship good for me, or does it just keep me from being alone, and that's why I stay, even though it's costing me more than it gives? Does this job hold real meaning for me, or does it just pay the bills, and I've convinced myself that's enough? Am I being the person I want to be, or the person others expect me to be, and I can't even tell the difference anymore? What do I actually want? Not what I was told I should want. Not what society defined as success. Not what my parents projected onto me. What I, in the deepest silence of my being, without anyone's influence, truly want. Those questions can only be heard in the silence. They only emerge when the noise drops low enough for the most important voice, yours, to be heard. And you won't let silence exist for even a second. You kill it every time it threatens to appear. You smother it with noise before it has a chance to show you what you need to see. And by doing that, by systematically assassinating every moment of potential silence, you keep yourself permanently disconnected from your own truth. You live the life of someone who doesn't know themselves because they never get quiet enough to listen. You make decisions based on what others think because you never give yourself the space to discover what you think. You chase goals that aren't yours because you never sit in silence and ask yourself which goals would actually be yours if nobody were watching. The addiction to noise isn't accidental. It's not a personal flaw. It's cultural. It's systemic. We live in a society engineered with industrial precision to keep you permanently stimulated. Every digital platform, every social network, every streaming service, every notification on your phone is designed by teams of engineers whose job is exactly this: to make sure you're never in silence. That there's always something to look at, something to read, something to listen to, something to react to, not for your well-being, for their business, because your attention is their product, and your silence is the only threat to their business model. If you were in silence, if you didn't need the constant stimulation they provide, their reason for existing would disappear. You've been trained, programmed, conditioned to fear silence since you were a kid. Culture told you that being alone is sad, that being in silence is boring, that needing constant company is normal, and not needing it is weird. They gave you a phone, a screen, a device that guarantees you never have to face the experience of silence again if you don't want to. And you used it. Every day, every hour, every available minute. Until the idea of being alone in silence for 30 minutes became something that produces the same anxiety a claustrophobic person would feel stepping into an elevator. Seneca saw the beginning of this phenomenon in his time, 2,000 years before smartphones, and he already diagnosed it as a disease of the soul. He watched the Romans of his day running from one entertainment to the next, from one party to another, from one spectacle to the next, without a moment of stillness, without an instant of reflection, without a second of real connection with themselves. And he told them, with the clarity that defined him, "You're running. You're not living. You're running. You're using the noise of the world as anesthesia, so you don't have to feel what's inside. And, while you run, life passes you by without you ever truly experiencing it." 2,000 years later, the running is the same. Only the escape vehicles have changed. Instead of spectacles at the Colosseum, you have Netflix and YouTube. Instead of Roman feasts that lasted weeks, you have social media that runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no possible pause. Instead of gossip in the Roman Forum, you have group chats where the noise of other people's opinions never turns off. Different technologies, different century, different civilization. Same exact function, to keep you so busy with external noise, so saturated with other people's stimuli, so perpetually entertained with other people's lives, that you never have to face the internal silence where the only person you truly need to know is waiting for you. And the tragedy is this: the more you run from the silence, the more you need the noise. And the more you need the noise, the less you know yourself. And the less you know yourself, the emptier you feel. And the emptier you feel, the more noise you chase to fill it. It's a downward cycle that feeds on itself and intensifies with every turn. The noise doesn't fill the void, it amplifies it. Because the void you feel isn't the absence of stimulation, it's the absence of connection with yourself. And that connection can only be restored in one place, the silence you keep running from. Your assignment for this lesson is to carve a pocket of real silence into your day, tomorrow. Not an hour, not 30 minutes, 10 minutes, just 10. And the rules are simple but non-negotiable. No phone, no music, no television, no podcast, no book, no conversation, No external stimulus of any kind, just you, sitting or walking, in complete silence, for 10 consecutive minutes. You don't have to meditate. You don't have to do anything special. Just be in silence with yourself, without escaping. And I want you to pay close attention to what happens inside you during those 10 minutes. The discomfort you're going to feel almost immediately. The anxiety that will show up as if you were doing something dangerous, when in reality you're just sitting there doing nothing. The almost irresistible urge to grab the phone, to put on music, to do something, anything, that breaks the uncomfortable silence. The thoughts that will surface when the noise stops covering them up. Thoughts that have been waiting months or years for a moment of silence to be heard. Everything that shows up in the silence is yours. It's information about you that you've been suppressing with noise for years. And those 10 minutes that are going to feel like an hour because you're not used to being with yourself without distractions, are the first step toward reclaiming the most important relationship you have, the relationship with yourself. Second Stoic lesson: you run from solitude, because when you're alone, you can't escape the person who makes you the most uncomfortable, you. There's a reason silence scares you so much. And it's not the one you think. It's not boredom. It's not the lack of stimulation. It's not that you have nothing to do. The reason is far deeper and far more uncomfortable to admit. When you're alone, when the noise shuts off, when the distractions disappear and there's nothing left between you and yourself, you come face to face with someone you don't like. Someone who makes you uncomfortable. Someone whose company you'd rather avoid if you could. And that person is you. Not the version of you that you present to the world. Not the character you play at work, in your family, on social media. Not the carefully constructed front that everyone sees and that you've perfected over years. The real version, the one that exists behind all the roles, the one with doubts they don't share, fears they don't admit, regrets they don't process, abandoned dreams that still ache, truths about themselves they'd rather not examine, because examining them would mean having to do something about it. That version of you only shows up in silence. It only becomes visible when there's nobody around to perform for, nobody to validate you, nobody to distract you from who you are, when all the masks come off. And that appearance, that unavoidable confrontation with your own naked truth, is what makes you flee from silence as if it were an existential threat, because in a way, it is. It's a threat to the comfortable version of yourself you've constructed, to the narrative you tell yourself about who you are, to the illusion that everything is fine when there are things that are not fine and that only become visible in the brutal honesty of silence. Seneca described this phenomenon with a line you should read several times until it sinks in. Everywhere we are ill, because the fault lies not in the place but in ourselves. Do you understand what he's saying? You're not running from solitude. You're running from you. And it doesn't matter where you go, what party you attend, what person you surround yourself with, what distraction you dive into. Wherever you go, there you are, with the same doubts, the same fears, the same unprocessed truths, the same uncomfortable person you tried to leave behind, but who travels with you everywhere, because they're the only company you can literally never separate from. You can run from the silence, but you can't run from yourself. And as long as you keep trying, as long as you keep filling every moment with noise so you don't have to hear yourself, you're putting off a confrontation that is inevitable, and that gets harder and more painful with every day you delay it. What exactly makes you uncomfortable about yourself when you're alone? You need to know. You need to identify it precisely, because what you don't identify controls you without you knowing it. For some, what shows up in the silence is guilt. Decisions they made that still weigh on them, people they hurt, opportunities they wasted. The silence shows them the ledger of their emotional and moral debts without filter or excuse, and that's unbearable. For others, what shows up is inadequacy, the feeling of not being enough, of not having achieved what they should have achieved at this point in their lives, of being far from the version of themselves they imagined when they were young. The silence shows them the distance between who they are and who they wanted to be, and that distance hurts too much to look at head-on. For others, what shows up is emptiness, not an external emptiness, an emptiness of meaning, the feeling that something fundamental is missing, that the life they're living, even though it works on the surface, doesn't have the depth they need to feel like it's worth it. The silence shows them that emptiness in all its vastness and the urgency of filling it with something real, not with more noise. And for many, what shows up is all of it at once. Guilt, inadequacy, and emptiness mixed into a cocktail so overwhelming that the instinctive response is obvious. Run. Grab the phone, call someone, turn on the TV. Anything to make that confrontation disappear. Anything to restore the anesthesia that noise provides. But here's the truth you need to accept, even though every fiber of your being wants to reject it. What shows up in the silence doesn't disappear when you go back to the noise. It doesn't leave. It doesn't dissolve. It doesn't resolve itself. It's still there, beneath the noise, beneath the distractions, beneath the shallow conversations and the glowing screens and the binge-watching and the endless scrolling you use as anesthesia. Waiting, growing, accumulating, fermenting, becoming more toxic with every day that passes without being confronted. It's like a debt you don't pay that compounds interest every single day. Unprocessed guilt doesn't evaporate. It becomes chronic resentment, a background bitterness that colors everything you do and every interaction you have without you understanding why you feel that permanent sourness. Unconfronted inadequacy doesn't resolve on its own. It becomes permanent anxiety, that constant feeling that you're not enough, that manifests in every area of your life, in your work, in your relationships, in the way you look at yourself in the mirror every morning. Unacknowledged emptiness doesn't get filled with more noise. It becomes a quiet depression that corrodes from the inside without you being able to find the cause, without any doctor being able to diagnose it precisely. Because the cause is buried under so many layers of noise and distraction that you don't even remember it anymore. You only feel its effects. The exhaustion without reason, the apathy without explanation, the feeling that something fundamental is missing but you can't name what it is. Silence doesn't create those problems. It reveals them. And that's the difference that changes everything. What gets revealed can be worked on. What stays hidden under the noise can't be worked on because you don't even know it's there. It shapes you without your knowledge. It controls you without your awareness. It destroys you slowly, silently, without you understanding why your life feels so heavy when everything should apparently be fine. Marcus Aurelius didn't run from what he found in the silence. He faced it every night, with brutal honesty. He wrote down his weaknesses. He acknowledged the day's failures. He confronted the parts of himself he didn't like, not because he enjoyed the process, because he understood that the only way to improve those parts was to see them first, and that the only way to see them was in the silence of reflection, without the distractions of the day covering them up. Epictetus taught that the freest person is not the one who can go wherever they want, not the one with the most entertainment options, not the one with the most people around them. It's the one who can be with themselves without needing to go anywhere. The one who can sit in silence, in an empty room, with no external stimulus, and not feel the desperate need to escape. the one who has made peace with what they find when they're alone. Not because what they find is perfect, not because they like everything they see, because they've learned to look at it without running, to accept it without being paralyzed, to work with it with patience and honesty without needing the noise of the world to cover it up so they can function. That's the freedom you're missing. You have freedom of movement, freedom of expression, freedom of choice, but you don't have the most fundamental freedom of all, the freedom to be with yourself in peace. And without that freedom, all the others are superficial. Because a person who can't be alone is a person chained to the need for company, and a person in chains, no matter how many other freedoms they have, is not free. Your assignment for this lesson is to identify what shows up when you're alone, not what you think shows up, what actually shows up. I want you to use the 10 minutes of silence from the previous assignment, and this time, instead of simply observing the discomfort, name it. What emotions come up? Guilt, anxiety, sadness, a sense of emptiness, inadequacy, regret. What thoughts appear? What does your mind talk about when nobody else is talking to it? What topics does the silence bring to the surface that the noise manages to bury? Write down what you discover, without judging it, without trying to fix it yet. Just name it. Just pull it out of the basement where you've been hiding it and bring it into the light where you can see it clearly. Because what you name loses power. What remains unnamed controls you. What is named informs you. And what informs you, you can work with. What controls you can only destroy you in silence, ironically. In the silence you give it when you refuse to give yourself the conscious silence where you could confront it. Third, Stoic lesson. Seneca voluntarily withdrew from the world because he knew that the crowd corrupts, and you keep surrounding yourself with noise, expecting to find peace outside. Seneca had a relationship with solitude that most people in his time didn't understand, and that most people in your time would understand even less. He withdrew, voluntarily, from the most stimulating and noisiest world that existed in his day, Rome, the capital of the empire, the center of power, the place where everything that mattered was happening. He stepped away from the parties, the banquets, the spectacles, the political intrigue, the brilliant conversations with the sharpest minds of his generation. He left, alone, to his villa, to write, to think, to be with himself in a silence he had chosen and that he guarded with a firmness many interpreted as arrogance or misanthropy. It was neither. It was wisdom. It was the deep understanding of something you need to understand right now, because your life depends on it, that the crowd corrupts. Not because people are bad, because people are noisy. And noise, no matter how well-intentioned, distorts your ability to hear yourself. Seneca wrote it with the clarity that defined him. Withdraw into yourself as much as you can. Associate with those who can make you better, and admit those whom you can improve. The process is mutual. Men learn while they teach. But he added a warning that applies directly to you. Avoid the crowd. Avoid the few. Avoid even the individual. I know of no one with whom I would wish you to share your company. Does that sound extreme? It is. Intentionally. Seneca was exaggerating to make a point that needed to be exaggerated, because the natural tendency of human beings is the opposite: to seek company constantly, to surround yourself with people constantly, to fill every gap of solitude with someone else's presence constantly. And that tendency, which seems natural and harmless, comes at a cost that almost nobody accounts for. The cost is the contamination of your mental clarity, an invisible cost that doesn't show up on any bill, that doesn't manifest as a sharp pain, that doesn't have a precise moment where you can say, "This is where I lost my clarity." It's a gradual, constant deterioration, imperceptible day by day, but devastating when you look at the accumulated result after years. Every person you interact with leaves a residue in your mind. Their opinions, their fears, their priorities, their judgments about what matters and what doesn't, their expectations about who you should be and how you should live, their anxieties, which spread as easily as a yawn. All of it enters your system like a virus that installs itself silently and starts running in the background without you noticing, altering your decisions, modifying your priorities, redefining your goals without your conscious consent. After an hour with certain people, you think differently, not because you chose to think differently after deep reflection, because their way of seeing the world seeped into your mind without you giving it permission to enter, without you activating any filter, without you questioning anything that was coming in. After an afternoon on social media, your priorities shift, not because you reflected and consciously decided to change your priorities, because the priorities of thousands of strangers, people whose judgment you don't respect and whose life you wouldn't envy if you saw it up close, infiltrated your value system and displaced yours like a silent invader that takes territory without firing a single shot. Seneca observed this phenomenon with the precision of a scientist studying a contagious disease. He said it's impossible to spend time with a crowd without something of that crowd sticking to you, that you return from every social encounter a little more greedy, a little more ambitious, a little more fearful, a little more insecure, a little further from your own truth, depending on who you were with. That the crowd doesn't just distract you from silence, it changes you, it alters your internal settings in ways that are subtle but cumulative. And if you never withdraw to recalibrate in solitude, those changes pile up until one day you wake up and don't recognize your own thoughts, because half of them aren't yours. They're echoes of the 1,000 voices you've been absorbing without a filter. This is exactly what's happening to you. Your opinions are a collage of other people's opinions. Your fears are partly borrowed fears you absorbed from your environment. Your priorities are a messy blend of what you actually value and what the people around you have convinced you that you should value. Your way of seeing the world is so contaminated by other people's perspectives that you no longer know which perspectives are originally yours, because you never withdraw. You never give yourself the space to clean the system. You never sit in silence to separate what's yours from what belongs to someone else. And the result is a borrowed identity. A life built on opinions that aren't yours, priorities you absorbed without questioning, and goals you chase not because they matter to you, but because someone, at some point, convinced you they should. And all of that feels like confusion, like lack of direction, like not knowing what you want. But it's not that you don't know what you want. It's that there's so much of other people's noise in your head that your own voice can't make itself heard. Seneca's withdrawal wasn't escape. It was mental hygiene. It was a system cleanse. It was the emotional equivalent of taking a shower after a day in a contaminated environment. Every time he withdrew, he returned to the world clearer, more centered, more in command of his own thoughts, more capable of interacting with others without losing his center, because he'd spent time alone recalibrating his internal compass. He'd separated what was his from what was borrowed. He'd listened to his own voice without the interference of the voices of Rome. Seneca distinguished between two types of life that you need to understand, because your imbalance between them explains a large part of your current confusion. Otium and negotium. Negotium is the active life, the life of work, of interactions, of participation in the world, of external building. It's necessary. It's where you build your career, where you contribute to your community, where you fulfill your role as a father, a partner, a professional, a citizen. Nobody is saying you should abandon negotium. But otium, productive retreat, solitude chosen with purpose, is equally necessary. It's where you process everything you lived through in negotium. Where you clean the residue that social interaction left stuck to your mind like emotional grime. Where you recover your own voice after listening to 1,000 other voices screaming in 1,000 different directions. Without otium, negotium consumes you, dilutes you, gradually turns you into an echo of others instead of a voice of your own. Transforms you into someone who functions but doesn't live, who produces but doesn't feel, who interacts but doesn't connect with anything real because they've lost connection with themselves. You live in permanent negotium, without a drop of otium, without a single moment of productive retreat, without an instant where your mind can process itself without the constant interference of the outside world. And the result is predictable. You're confused, contaminated with other people's opinions, unable to tell what you think from what others think, chasing goals you're not sure are yours, and feeling empty when you reach them, because they never were. Your assignment for this lesson is to practice your first deliberate retreat. You don't need to go to a country villa like Seneca. You need 1 hour per week that you're going to protect as sacred. No negotiation, no exceptions, no temptation to fill it with something productive. During that hour, you will not work. You will not consume content. You will not socialize. You will not solve problems. You will be with yourself, in silence. With a notebook, if you want, to jot down whatever surfaces, but with no external stimulus contaminating the process. It's your hour of otium, your hour of mental hygiene, your hour to recalibrate the compass that the week of noise knocked off course, your hour to separate other people's voices from your own. To ask yourself what you really think, what you really want, what you really feel, without anyone watching you, expecting something from you, or influencing your answers. 1 hour a week. That's the minimum Seneca would have considered acceptable. He'd probably say, it's insufficient. But for someone who hasn't had a single minute of conscious retreat in years, 1 hour a week is a revolution. Start there. And watch how, week after week, your mental clarity improves, your decisions become more your own, and the chronic confusion you'd accepted as normal starts to fade. Fourth Stoic lesson. You confuse being accompanied with being connected, and you can feel lonelier in a crowd than in an empty room. There's a distinction nobody taught you, and it explains why you can be surrounded by people and feel deeply alone. Why you can have a packed social calendar and a growing void inside with every interaction. Why you can have hundreds of contacts in your phone and not have a single person you'd call if your world fell apart at 3 in the morning. The distinction is between being accompanied and being connected. They're two completely different things that you've been treating as one your entire life. And that confusion has led you to seek quantity of presence when what you need is quality of connection. It has led you to fill your life with people who occupy space but never reach your center, who are physically present but emotionally absent, who share your time but not your truth. Being accompanied is having bodies nearby. It's sharing physical space with other human beings. It's having people around who generate noise, conversation, activity, the illusion that you're not alone. It's the party where you meet 20 people and can't remember a single name the next morning. It's the family dinner where everyone's at the same table, but each person is on their phone, in their own world, sharing the tablecloth but not sharing anything real. It's the office full of co-workers you trade shallow jokes with, but to whom you've never said a single important truth about your life. Being connected is something else entirely. It's feeling seen by another person, not looked at. Seen. It's feeling that someone understands not just what you say, but what you don't say. That they perceive what's behind your words. That they know you without the masks and accept you without the performances. It's being able to sit in silence with someone without the silence being uncomfortable, without it needing to be filled with empty conversation, because the connection doesn't need noise to exist. Shared silence with someone you're truly connected to is one of the fullest experiences a human being can have, and it's an experience you've probably had very few times in your life. Most of your social interactions are company without connection, presence without depth, noise that covers the silence but doesn't fill the void. And that's why, after a social night, after hours of conversation and laughter and activity, you can walk through your front door feeling lonelier than before you left. Because the hunger you had wasn't for company, it was for connection. And company without connection is like eating air. It fills the stomach momentarily, but doesn't nourish. And when the effect wears off, the hunger returns more intense, because now you know you ate and you're still starving, which feels worse than simply not having eaten at all. Seneca understood this at a profound level. That's why he withdrew from the social noise of Rome, not because he didn't value human company, because he valued real connection and knew that real connection is rare, and that most social interactions are a poor substitute that not only fails to satisfy, but actually increases the sensation of emptiness by creating the illusion that you're meeting a need you're not actually touching. He wrote something you should take seriously. It is better to have a few true friends than many superficial acquaintances. That's not a pretty phrase to hang on a wall. It's an operating principle that should redefine how you organize your social life. Because you're investing enormous amounts of time and energy maintaining superficial relationships that don't nourish you, while ignoring the need for deep relationships that would. You're prioritizing quantity of interactions over quality. You're choosing the noise of many over the shared silence of the few who truly matter. And there's a reason you prioritize quantity over quality, a reason that operates beneath your awareness and that you rarely examine. Real connection requires something that deeply terrifies you: vulnerability. To truly connect with another person, you have to show who you really are, without the professional mask, without the character of strength you built so nobody sees your cracks, without the edited, polished, approved for public consumption version you present in every social interaction. You have to risk being seen in your imperfection, your confusion, your fear, your insecurity, your complete unfiltered humanity. And that risk, the risk of being seen as you actually are, and possibly rejected precisely for what you really are, is too high for most people. It's a risk your ego isn't willing to take, because the possibility of rejection hurts more than the certainty of disguised loneliness. So they choose, and you choose with them, the safe alternative. Superficial company, where nobody sees anything real, where the mask stays intact, where conversations stay on the comfortable surface of impersonal topics, where vulnerability isn't necessary because nobody expects or wants depth, and where the deep loneliness remains absolutely untouched beneath the appearance of a busy, full social life. You look connected. You look surrounded. You look like someone who doesn't have a loneliness problem. But underneath all that social noise, you're as alone as the person who never leaves their house, maybe more alone, because at least that person doesn't have the illusion that their loneliness is solved. Epictetus taught that the quality of your life is determined by the quality of your relationships, not the quantity. and that the quality of your relationships is determined by your capacity to be genuine in them. If you can't be yourself with the people around you, those people aren't your company. They're your audience. And performing for an audience is a form of loneliness dressed up as a social life. Marcus Aurelius, constantly surrounded by people, senators, generals, advisors, servants, ambassadors, family, was probably one of the most accompanied and most alone men of his time, because most of the people around him were there for his position, not for him. They sought him out for what they could get, not for who he was, and he knew it. He felt it every day. That loneliness in the middle of a crowd, that experience of being surrounded by bodies but disconnected from souls, is what drove him to write in the solitude of his tent the most honest reflections any human being has ever put on paper. Because only in solitude could he be himself without the role of emperor getting in the way. Only in solitude did he find the connection that constant company never gave him, the connection with himself. There's a paradox in all of this that you need to see with total clarity. The person who knows how to be alone is the one who best knows how to be with others. Because the person who knows how to be alone doesn't need the company of others to feel complete, and because they don't need it, they can choose it freely. They can choose who to be with based on the quality of the connection, not on the desperation of not being alone. They can say no to superficial company because the silence of their own solitude is preferable to the empty noise of an interaction without depth. They can wait for relationships that nourish instead of accepting any relationship that simply fills space. But the person who doesn't know how to be alone, who runs from silence, who needs the presence of others the way they need oxygen, that person doesn't choose their company. They accept it. They tolerate it. They cling to whatever's available rather than face the silence. And the result is relationships that don't nourish, that drain, that consume time and energy without contributing anything real, the emotional equivalent of eating cardboard, something that fills the mouth but doesn't feed the body. Your assignment for this lesson is to do a real connection inventory. I want you to take your list of close people, the people you spend the most time with, and evaluate them with brutal honesty. For each person, ask yourself 2 questions. First, can I be completely myself with this person without a mask and without performing? Second, after spending time with this person, do I feel more full or more empty? The people where both answers are positive are your real connections. Protect them, invest in them, deepen them. The people where one or both answers are negative are company without connection. Noise that covers the loneliness without resolving it. And the time you invest in those relationships is time you could be investing in the productive solitude that returns you to yourself, or in the few real relationships that genuinely nourish you. 5th Stoic lesson. Solitude is not a punishment. It's a laboratory, the only place where you can hear yourself without interference. Your entire life you were taught that solitude is a bad thing, that being alone is a problem that needs solving, that if you're alone it's because you failed at something, because you're not interesting enough, because nobody wants you around, because there's a defect in you that condemns you to isolation. You were taught to associate solitude with social failure, with sadness, with depression, with something that happens to people who don't have success, who don't have charisma, who don't have the ability to attract and keep people around them. That teaching was one of the most damaging you ever received, and you need to uninstall it from your operating system today, because as long as it's there, it's going to block you from accessing the most powerful resource you have for your personal transformation. Solitude is not a punishment. It's a laboratory. A laboratory is a controlled space where you experiment, where you test, where you discover. where the conditions are designed specifically so you can observe with clarity what under normal conditions would be impossible to see. A laboratory eliminates the noise, the external variables, the interference, so the pure signal can be detected and analyzed. Your solitude is exactly that. It's the space where external variables disappear, where other people's opinions go quiet, where other people's expectations stop pressing on you, where the roles you play become unnecessary because there's no audience, where the most important signal of your life, your own inner voice, can finally be heard without interference. What can be discovered in this laboratory? Everything that matters. In solitude, you discover what you truly think. Not what you think when you're in a meeting and need to say the right thing. Not what you think when you're with friends and need to fit in. Not what you think when you're on social media and need to seem smart or informed. What you think when nobody's listening. When there are no social consequences for your thoughts. When you can allow yourself the rawest honesty without fear of judgment. Those thoughts, the ones that only surface in solitude, are your real thoughts. And they're probably quite different from the ones you express publicly. In solitude, you discover what you truly feel, not what you pretend to feel to meet the expectations others have of you. Not the strength you project because you were taught to believe that a man can't show vulnerability, that a man has to tough it out, that a man has to be the rock that nothing moves. Not the satisfaction you perform because admitting that something in your life isn't working, that your marriage hurts, that your job empties you, that your routine suffocates you, would require changes that scare you more than the discomfort of staying where you are. What you actually feel, without the armor, without the costume. The real frustration you cover up with professional smiles every morning. The real exhaustion you hide behind a compulsive productivity that everyone admires but that you know is just another way of running. The real sadness you disguise as normalcy because admitting it would mean admitting that something needs to change, and that terrifies you. All of that only reveals itself in the laboratory of solitude, where you don't need to protect yourself from anyone, because there's no one to protect yourself from except your own deeply rooted tendency to lie to yourself, so you don't have to face what the truth would ask you to do. In solitude, you discover what you truly want, not what society decided you should want at your age, with your education, with your financial situation, not what your family expects of you, not what your friends consider success, what you, without anyone's influence, without anyone's pressure, without anyone's approval, actually desire for your life. And that information is the most valuable you can get, because without it, every decision you make is a gamble based on other people's data. Every goal you chase is potentially someone else's goal. Every achievement you reach can feel empty because it wasn't your achievement. It was the achievement someone else defined as important. The Stoics used solitude as the primary laboratory of their philosophical practice, not as a supplement. As the center. Marcus Aurelius didn't write his meditations in public. He didn't philosophize at banquets. He didn't reflect in Senate meetings. He withdrew to the solitude of his tent, and there, with no one watching, with no need to be emperor or philosopher or public figure, he met Marcus Aurelius, the human being, with his fears, his doubts, his contradictions, the most stripped down and most honest version of himself. And in that encounter, in that solitary confrontation with his own truth, he found answers that no advisor, no senator, no general could give him, because the important answers don't come from outside. They come from the internal laboratory that you can only enter in solitude. Seneca described his retreats as moments of harvest. He said that active life was the planting and that solitude was the harvest. that in activity you plant seeds of experience, and that in solitude you gather the fruits of those experiences by processing them, by reflecting on them, by extracting the lessons that the speed of active life doesn't allow you to extract in real time. Without the harvest, the planting is useless. You plant and plant, but never gather. And the result is a life full of unprocessed experiences, unlearned lessons, unidentified patterns, repeated mistakes, because you never stopped long enough to understand why they happened the first time. You've been planting for years without ever harvesting. You've lived experience after experience, relationship after relationship, job after job, crisis after crisis, without ever stopping to process what you've lived through in the reflective solitude that processing requires. And the result is predictable. You repeat patterns, you make the same mistakes with different names, you chase the same unsatisfying goals in a different disguise, and you wonder why nothing changes when you change everything external without changing anything internal. Nothing changes because you never enter the laboratory where real change happens. You never sit in solitude to process what you've been through. You never harvest. Epictetus taught his students that reflection in solitude is as necessary for the soul as food is for the body. That a person who doesn't reflect in solitude is like a person who eats without digesting. They ingest experiences one after another, without pause, without processing, without the inner work that converts raw experience into usable wisdom. But they don't digest them. They don't extract the nutrients. They don't convert them into assimilated learning that changes the way they live. And the result is permanent existential indigestion. A life full of raw, unprocessed experiences that sit heavy in the stomach of the soul instead of nourishing its growth. A deep fatigue that can't be explained by physical activity, but by the accumulation of undigested life. Sound familiar? That exhaustion you feel that has no medical explanation. That feeling of being full but not nourished. That existential fatigue that doesn't resolve with vacation, because vacation is just more unprocessed experiences stacked on top of the previous ones. All of that is the direct result of living without a laboratory, of planting without harvesting, of eating without digesting, of living without the reflective solitude that turns life into learning. Your assignment for this lesson is to use your next period of solitude not as an exercise in enduring silence, but as a laboratory session with a specific purpose. I want you to enter the solitude with one question, a question you've been avoiding, a question whose answer you don't know because you've never given it the silence it needs for the answer to emerge. It could be, what do I actually want for the next 5 years of my life? It could be, is this relationship helping me grow or keeping me comfortable? It could be, what am I avoiding facing? It could be any question you feel has been waiting for a moment of silence to be answered. Don't hunt for the answer. Sit with the question, in silence, without forcing, without obsessively analyzing. Just let it be. Like a seed you plant and give space to germinate. The answer will come. Maybe not in the first 10 minutes, maybe not in the first session. But if you give it space, if you give it silence, if you give it the absence of interference that only solitude can provide, the answer will emerge with a clarity that will surprise you, because the answer was always there. It just needed silence to be heard. Sixth Stoic lesson. Marcus Aurelius wrote his deepest thoughts in the solitude of his military tent, surrounded by war but at peace with himself. There's an image I want you to visualize, because it contains a truth that can change your relationship with solitude forever. It's nighttime. We're on the northern frontier of the Roman Empire, somewhere along the Danube, around 170 AD. The military camp is quiet. The fires are dying down. The soldiers are sleeping or standing guard at the perimeters. The cold is brutal. The day's news was bad. More casualties, more disease, more logistical problems with no easy solution. Tomorrow will bring more impossible decisions, more responsibilities that would crush any normal person. And in the emperor's tent, by the light of a candle casting shadows on the fabric walls, a man sits alone, no advisors at his side, no generals briefing him, no senators competing for his attention. He's alone, with a notebook, with a candle, with his thoughts. And in that space of absolute solitude, surrounded by war on every side, surrounded by death, by uncertainty, by pressure that doesn't let up for a single day, that man writes the most serene, most profound, most luminous words ever written about the art of living a meaningful life. He's not writing to publish. He's not writing to impress. He's not writing for anyone but himself. He writes because solitude gives him access to a part of himself that the day, with all its noise and urgency, won't let him reach. He writes because in the silence of that tent, when the emperor takes off the armor and only the man remains, truth emerges in a way it cannot emerge when someone is watching. He writes because solitude is the only place where he can be completely honest, where he can admit his exhaustion without appearing weak, where he can acknowledge his fears without losing authority, where he can question his decisions without creating panic around him, where he can be human without the weight of the empire demanding he be something more than human. The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius are the fruit of chosen solitude in the most adverse circumstances imaginable. They weren't written at a wellness retreat with ocean views. They weren't written at a philosophical spa with ambient music and herbal tea. They weren't written in the comfort of a study with perfect lighting and climate control. They were written in a war zone, in the cold, in the uncertainty, in the exhaustion, in conditions most people would consider the worst possible for reflection and for any kind of inner work. And yet, it's precisely in those conditions where solitude revealed its most impressive and most telling power. Because solitude doesn't need perfect conditions to work. It doesn't need absolute external silence. It doesn't need a beautiful location or a curated environment. It doesn't need your life to be in order, your problems to be solved, your situation to be stable. It needs one thing only, that you choose to be with yourself instead of running from yourself. Even when the external circumstances are total chaos, even when everything around you is on fire, even when the reality surrounding you is so loud it seems impossible to find a single drop of silence. That inner solitude, that internal citadel we talked about in the previous episode, can exist in the center of the most violent storm if you decide to inhabit it instead of letting the external hurricane drag you away. That destroys your main excuse. Because your excuse for not being alone, for not seeking silence, for not practicing reflective solitude, is that you don't have time, that your life is too busy, that there are too many things demanding your attention, that you can't afford to sit in silence when there's so much to do. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire. He led wars. He managed the lives of millions of people. He faced simultaneous crises on multiple fronts, and he found time for solitude. Every night, without exception. If he could, with the most demanding life imaginable, you can. Your excuse isn't valid. It never was. What you lack isn't time. It's the decision to use some of your time to be with yourself instead of filling every second with activity and noise. There's something else about Marcus Aurelius's practice you need to see. He didn't just seek solitude, he used solitude with purpose. He didn't sit in his tent and let his mind wander aimlessly. He asked himself specific questions. He confronted himself with specific truths. He gave himself specific instructions for the following day. The solitude wasn't passive. It was active. It was inner work of the most demanding and most productive kind. It was the space where he processed the chaos of the day and converted it into clarity for the next one. He asked himself, did I act according to my principles today, or did I let the pressure of the moment carry me? He confronted himself. That decision I made at midday wasn't fair. It was driven by frustration, not reason. Tomorrow I need to correct course. He reminded himself of truths that the urgency of the day made him forget. Everything is temporary. This crisis will pass. What matters is how I behave during it, not whether I manage to solve it completely. All of that happened in solitude. All of it required the absence of others to be possible. Because in the presence of others, Marcus Aurelius had to be the emperor. He had to project confidence. He had to make decisions without showing doubt. He had to be the rock the empire stood on. Only in solitude could he allow himself to be a man who doubts, who fears, who makes mistakes, who needs recalibrating. Only in solitude could he take off the armor without anyone seeing him vulnerable. And that solitary vulnerability, that honesty only silence allows, was what gave him the strength to put the armor back on every morning and lead with a clarity his generals admired without knowing where it came from. It came from the solitude. It came from the nights alone with the candle and the notebook. It came from the nightly laboratory where the emperor became a student of himself, and where the lessons learned in solitude became the wisdom he applied in public. You need your tent, not a literal one, a metaphorical one. You need a space and a moment where you can take off the armor you wear during the day, where you can stop being the competent professional, the strong father, the reliable friend, the steady partner, where you can simply be you, with your doubts, with your fears, with your unanswered questions, with the honesty that only blooms when nobody is watching. Marcus Aurelius didn't have Wi-Fi in his tent. He didn't have notifications interrupting his thoughts every 30 seconds. He didn't have the option of distracting himself with a screen when the solitude got uncomfortable and the thoughts got hard to face. He had to be there, with himself. No way out. No digital anesthesia. No crutch of an instant distraction an inch from his hand. He had to stay with whatever emerged, however uncomfortable, however painful, however confrontational it was. And from that total absence of escape, from that solitude with no emergency exit, one of the most important works in the history of human thought was born. A work that continues to transform lives 2,000 years later. Imagine what could be born from your solitude if you gave it the same chance. If instead of fleeing from the silence every night with the television, the phone, social media, or any of the 1,000 available forms of escape, you sat for 10 minutes with your own mind and let it speak without interruption. You don't know what's in there waiting to be discovered because you've never given it the opportunity to come to light. There are thoughts you've never thought because the noise drowned them before they could form. There are answers that have been waiting years for a question that only silence can ask. There's a version of you that only exists in solitude and that you've never met because you never stayed long enough for it to show up. Your assignment for this lesson is to create your version of Marcus Aurelius's tent, a physical space and a specific time that you associate exclusively with reflective solitude. It could be a corner of your home. It could be a bench in a park. It could be your car parked in silence before you walk through the door after work. What matters isn't where. What matters is that it's a place your mind associates with, this is where I take off the armor. And every time you enter that space, do what Marcus Aurelius did. Review your day, not with judgment, with curiosity? Where did you act from your principles and where did you get swept up? What decision would you make differently if you could? What do you need tomorrow to be 1 degree better than today? Write if you want, or just think. But do it in solitude, without an audience, without a mask, without armor. Just you, processing your life in the only place you can process it with total honesty, the silence of your own company. 7th Stoic lesson. You need other people to not feel alone because you never learned to be your own company, and that dependence makes you weak. There's a question that's going to make you uncomfortable, and you need to answer it with the rawest honesty you can muster. Can you spend an entire day alone, with no contact with anyone, without feeling anxious, incomplete, or desperate for the company of another human being? If the answer is no, you have a problem that goes far beyond a social preference. You have a dependence that doesn't get called that because society has normalized it to the point of making it invisible. But it works exactly like any other dependence. You need the substance, in this case, the presence of others, to feel okay. Without it, you experience withdrawal symptoms, anxiety, restlessness, a feeling of emptiness, an urgent need to contact someone, to be with someone, to not be alone under any circumstances. That's not love of company. It's fear of yourself. It's the inability to be your own sufficient company, and that inability makes you deeply vulnerable in ways you've probably never considered. It makes you vulnerable in your relationships because you don't choose who to be with. You settle for whoever's available. You accept company that drains you, that diminishes you, that makes you feel worse about yourself, because the alternative, being alone with yourself in silence, feels worse than any bad company. You stay in relationships you should have ended years ago. Relationships with no respect, no growth, nothing real, because the fear of the solitude that would follow the breakup is stronger than the pain that relationship causes you every day. You become easy to manipulate because anyone who offers you company holds an enormously powerful bargaining chip they can use to control you, to condition you, to keep you where they want you. The threat of leaving, of abandoning you, of taking away the substance you depend on. And you, to avoid that threat, make concessions you shouldn't make. You accept terms you shouldn't accept. You tolerate behavior you shouldn't tolerate. All to avoid being alone. All to avoid facing the silence that terrifies you. It makes you vulnerable in your decision-making because you're always calculating how your decisions will affect your access to company. You don't make the right decision. You make the decision that guarantees you won't end up alone. You don't set boundaries because boundaries might make someone walk away. You don't say what you think because saying what you think might create conflict, and conflict might lead to isolation. You live constantly editing yourself, trimming your truths, softening your opinions, sacrificing your authenticity on the altar of keeping someone close. It makes you vulnerable in your personal growth because growth requires solitude, and you flee from it. You can't reflect deeply if there's always someone present. You can't confront your most uncomfortable truths if there's always an audience ready to judge you or to comfort you before the pain does its transformative work. You can't truly know yourself if you're always being the version of you others expect, rather than the version that emerges when nobody's watching. And it makes you emotionally vulnerable, because your mood depends on the presence of others. If someone is with you, you're fine. If not, you're not. That means anyone who enters or exits your life has the power to drastically alter your emotional well-being. You're not stable. You're stable only when someone is nearby. And that conditional stability isn't stability. It's dependence disguised as normal. The Stoics considered emotional self-sufficiency one of the pillars of a good life. Not total self-sufficiency, because they understood that human beings are social and need genuine connection. But baseline self-sufficiency, the ability to be with yourself without falling apart. The ability to be alone without feeling that something fundamental is missing. The ability to be your own sufficient company so that when you choose to be with others, it's out of desire, not desperate need. Seneca put it with a clarity that cuts like a scalpel. The wise man is self-sufficient, not because he wants to live without friends, but because he can. He can. He has the ability. Not the obligation, not the desire to isolate himself. The ability to be okay alone. When friends are there, he enjoys them genuinely and deeply more than the person who desperately needs them, because he enjoys them from fullness rather than from emptiness. When they're not, he's fine. He doesn't crumble. He doesn't panic. He doesn't feel like his world is collapsing because he's alone for a night, a weekend, an entire week. He can be alone and be at peace. And from that peace, from that solid, unbreakable foundation of emotional self-sufficiency, he can build relationships that are free, chosen with discernment, genuine in their depth, instead of relationships that are emotional crutches, dependence disguised as love, escape mechanisms from the inner silence he doesn't want to face. Epictetus, who lived in poverty and under conditions most people would consider isolating, taught that the person who can't be alone is a slave to company. And a person who is a slave to anything, even something apparently positive like human company, is not free. Freedom requires the ability to do without. To be able to say, I enjoy being with you, but I don't need you to be okay. That sentence, which sounds cold on first reading, is actually the foundation of the healthiest love that exists. Because love that comes from need isn't love. It's dependence with a nice name. It's using another person as a tool to avoid facing your own emptiness. It's asking someone to do for you the work that only you can do. Learning to be with yourself. Marcus Aurelius learned to be his own company in the loneliest conditions of power. Because power isolates. Power creates distance between you and everyone else. And Marcus Aurelius, instead of fighting that isolation by filling himself with superficial company, as other emperors before him had done, chose to inhabit that solitude, chose to become his own friend, chose to turn the loneliness of power into the laboratory where he built himself as a human being, not because he liked being alone, because he understood that the alternative, depending on the company of others for his emotional well-being, was a weakness an emperor couldn't afford, and that a man who wants to live a full life can't afford either. Neither can you. Not at this point. Not after 7 episodes of inner work. Not after accepting your situation, confronting your lies, dropping your weight, looking in your mirror, burying your old self, starting to act, and mastering your emotions. All of that construction wobbles if you depend emotionally on others to hold it up. The entire new identity you're building is fragile if it needs the constant validation and presence of other people to stay standing. It needs an internal foundation, solid ground. And that ground is the ability to be alone without needing anyone to complete you. Your assignment for this lesson is to do something you've probably never done voluntarily in your adult life. I want you to spend an entire afternoon alone, not an hour, an afternoon. 4 or 5 hours where you're with yourself without anyone's company, without communicating with anyone by phone or text, without social media as a substitute for company. You can do whatever you want during that afternoon. Walk, read, cook, sit at a cafe, go to a park, whatever, but alone, completely alone, without the crutch of another human being filling the space. And I want you to observe 3 things. First, when the discomfort shows up and what form it takes: anxiety, boredom, A sense of emptiness, the urge to call someone. Second, what thoughts and emotions emerge when there's no one to distract you from yourself? Third, whether at some point during that afternoon, maybe after the initial discomfort passes, you feel something you didn't expect. A calm, a clarity, a sense that for the first time in a long time, you're actually present with yourself. That feeling, if it shows up, is the beginning of emotional self-sufficiency. It's the first moment you discover that you can be your own company, that you don't need anyone to be okay. That from that not needing, from that solid foundation of self-sufficiency, you can choose who to be with from a genuine freedom that dependence, by definition, never allowed you to have. Eighth Stoic lesson. In solitude, you discover who you are when nobody's watching, what you think when nobody's listening, what you want when nobody's influencing you. There are 3 questions that define the difference between a person who knows themselves and a person who's been playing a character without realizing it. 3 questions that can only be answered in a specific place and under specific conditions. 3 questions that, if you can answer them honestly, give you access to a level of self-knowledge most people never reach because they never create the conditions for the answers to emerge. Who are you when nobody's watching? What do you think when nobody's listening? What do you want when nobody's influencing you? The first question reveals your real character, not the character you display in public. Not the person you are when you know there are eyes on you, when the social pressure to seem good, competent, decent, successful is active. The person you are when the camera turns off, when the door closes, when nobody's going to find out what you do or don't do. Do you keep the promises you make to yourself when nobody's going to check? Do you do the right thing when nobody's going to applaud or judge you? Do you maintain your standards when the only person who'll notice is you? Or do you slack off? Do you allow yourself things you wouldn't allow if someone were observing? Do you act in ways that would embarrass you if they were made public? The distance between who you are when you're being watched and who you are when you're not is the exact measure of your integrity. If the distance is small, you have integrity. You're consistent. You're the same person in public and in private. If the distance is large, you're living a double standard that corrodes you internally, even if you don't recognize it. Because every time you act differently in private than you do in public, a part of you registers the inconsistency. A part of you knows the public character is a lie. And that awareness of your own falseness, even if it's subconscious, erodes your self-respect in a way that's silent but constant. Marcus Aurelius asked himself this question every night. He asked whether he'd acted during the day according to his principles, or whether the pressure of his role had led him to act in ways that contradicted what he truly believed. And the honesty with which he answered that question in the solitude of his tent is what made him the ruler he was. Because the person who measures themselves with honesty in private is the person who acts with integrity in public. The invisible work of solitude produces the visible results of character. The second question reveals your real thoughts, the thoughts you never share, the ones you consider too dark, too strange, too contradictory, too politically incorrect, too vulnerable to be expressed in public. In solitude, those thoughts come out, without censorship, without a filter, without the need to be acceptable to an audience, and those censored thoughts are the ones you most need to hear, because many times they contain truths that your conscious mind has blocked to protect the narrative you tell yourself about your life. I think I made a mistake getting married so young. I don't like the person I'm becoming. I'm jealous of my best friend, and I'm ashamed to admit it. I feel like a failure, even though I look successful from the outside. I'm not sure I believe in the things I say I believe in. Those thoughts exist inside you. They're there right now as you listen to this. And if you don't give them space in solitude, if you don't allow them to exist and be examined, they become undercurrents that influence your behavior in ways you don't understand. The person who doesn't examine their private thoughts is being governed by them without knowing it. Like a driver with a blindfold on, the car is moving, but they have no idea where it's going. Epictetus insisted that the examined life, the life where your thoughts are observed and questioned by yourself in solitude, is the only life worth living, not because thinking is better than doing. Because thinking clearly about what you actually think is the prerequisite for doing things that actually matter to you. The third question is the most transformative of the three and the hardest to answer honestly, because it requires you to separate your voice from 1,000 other voices that have been speaking inside your head for decades, passing themselves off as yours. What do you want when nobody's influencing you? We're so saturated with influence, so bombarded by advertising, by social media, by family expectations, by peer pressure, by cultural definitions of success and failure, that most people can't distinguish their own desires from the desires that were implanted by their environment without their conscious consent. It's like trying to hear your own voice in a stadium full of people screaming. The voice is there, but the noise drowns it out so completely you can't even be sure it exists. You want a car of a certain brand. Is it because you actually care about that brand, because you tested many options and that one resonates with something genuine in you? Or because advertising and social pressure convinced you that brand says something about who you are and how much you're worth? You want a promotion at work. Is it because that role excites you, because the responsibilities it brings genuinely fire you up? Or because society taught you that your worth as a man is measured by your position in a corporate hierarchy and that not climbing is failing? You want a bigger house. Is it because you actually need the space, because your life requires more rooms and more square footage? Or because your neighbors, your friends, your family, your co-workers decided that a big house is proof you made it and a small one is proof you didn't? You can't answer those questions in the middle of the noise, because the noise is precisely the source of the contamination. Only in solitude, only when the external voices go quiet and the only voice left is yours, can you begin to distinguish what you truly want from what you were taught to want. And that distinction, when you make it with brutal honesty in the silence of your own company, can change the direction of your life in ways you never imagined. Seneca warned about the danger of living according to the desires of the crowd. He said the person who follows the crowd can't call any of their decisions their own, because they're all inherited decisions absorbed, copied from an environment they never questioned. He said retreat into solitude is the only antidote to this contamination. The only space where you can ask yourself, do I want this, or does the world want it through me? And find an answer that's actually yours. Marcus Aurelius asked himself this question often. He wondered whether the goals he was chasing belonged to him or to the empire, whether the expectations he was trying to meet were the ones he set for himself or the ones Roman society imposed on him, whether the life he was living was the one he would have chosen if he'd had total freedom to choose. And those questions, asked in the radical solitude of his tent, gave him a clarity about his own desires that no advisor and no public conversation could provide. Your assignment for this lesson is to answer the three questions in solitude, with pen and paper, without rushing, without censoring, without worrying about what would be acceptable if someone read it. Nobody's going to read it. This is between you and you. Question 1. Who am I when nobody's watching? Describe the difference between your public self and your private self. Where are you consistent? Where is there a gap that bothers you? Question 2. What do I think when nobody's listening? Write down the thoughts you've never shared with anyone, the ones you consider too dark, too vulnerable, or too contradictory. Don't judge them, just let them exist on the page. Question 3. What do I want when nobody's influencing me? If you could design your life with no social pressure, no outside expectations, no external shoulds, what would it look like? What would you pursue? What would you abandon? What would you change? The answers to those 3 questions are the most accurate map of who you truly are. A map nobody else can draw for you. A map that can only be traced in solitude, with brutal honesty, without the interference of the voices that have been dictating your direction for decades. A map that only exists when the noise shuts off, when social pressure disappears, and when the truth finally has the space and the silence it needs to speak with the clarity you deserve to hear. 9th Stoic lesson. Epictetus lived as a slave, and then as a free man in poverty, and he taught that whoever learns to be alone learns to be free. Of the 3 great Stoics, Epictetus is the one with the most authority to speak about solitude, not because he chose it from comfort like Seneca, who could retreat to a luxurious villa when the noise of Rome bothered him, not because he found it in power like Marcus Aurelius, who had the solitude of the throne where nobody can truly accompany you. Epictetus has authority because solitude was imposed on him by the most brutal circumstances possible, and he turned it into the source of his inner freedom. He was a slave. For years, his life didn't belong to him. Another human being decided what he did, when he slept, how much he ate, whether he deserved a beating or a moment of peace. He had no possessions. He had no rights. He had no ability to choose who to be with or when to be alone. And in those conditions, in the total absence of external freedom, Epictetus discovered something that transformed not only his life, but the history of human thought. That the deepest freedom has nothing to do with external circumstances. It has to do with your ability to be with yourself in any circumstance, and to find in your own company something no chain can take from you. When he was freed, he didn't become a wealthy man. He didn't accumulate possessions. He didn't fill his life with material comforts or constant company to compensate for the years of deprivation. He lived in poverty, voluntarily, with the bare minimum, in an austerity that would have horrified most of his contemporaries. His home in Nicopolis was so modest that a thief stole his only possession of value, an iron lamp, and Epictetus wasn't fazed. He simply bought a clay one and moved on with his life. Why did he live that way? Not out of masochism, not out of inability to generate wealth. His school was successful, and he could have charged more. He lived that way because he had discovered in the solitude of slavery that external possessions, including the constant company of others, are crutches. They're things you depend on, and when they're taken away, you collapse. And Epictetus didn't want to depend on anything that could be taken from him. He wanted to be free. And freedom, real freedom, the kind that can't be revoked by any emperor or any circumstance, requires one thing only: the ability to be enough for yourself. He taught his students with the ferocity of someone who had tested this truth under the most extreme conditions. Who is free? The one who desires nothing that depends on another. He didn't say, the one who has everything they want. He said, the one who desires nothing that depends on another. That includes company. If you need another person's presence to feel complete, you depend on something outside your control. And what's outside your control can be taken from you at any moment. A person leaves, a relationship ends, a friend disappears, and if your well-being depended on that presence, your well-being crumbles with it. That's not freedom. It's a sophisticated form of slavery where the chains are invisible but just as restrictive as iron ones. Epictetus pushed this teaching into uncomfortable territory his students would rather not explore. He asked them, "Can you be alone in a room without anxiety? If you can't, you're a slave to company. Can you lose someone you love and keep functioning? If you can't, that person is your master, not your companion. Can you face an entire day without talking to anyone and feel at peace? If you can't, social noise is your drug, and solitude is your withdrawal." Those questions aren't rhetorical. They're not philosophical provocations designed to impress. They're diagnostic. They're the equivalent of a blood test for the soul. They were Epictetus's way of showing his students, with a precision that left no room for self-deception, where their invisible chains were, where the dependencies they called normal needs or natural preferences were actually structural weaknesses that made them vulnerable to anyone and anything that had the power to give or take away what they believed. They needed to function, and his students, just like you right now, resisted accepting the diagnosis. They said that needing company is human, that wanting to be with others is natural, that solitude is unnatural. And Epictetus didn't argue with that. He granted that the desire for company is natural, but he pointed out, with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation hundreds of times, that there's a world of difference between desiring something and needing it to function. Desiring company is human and healthy. Needing it to keep from falling apart is a dependence that makes you a slave to anyone who can give it or take it away. Epictetus's solution wasn't permanent isolation. It wasn't becoming a hermit who rejects all human contact. That would be another form of dependence on avoidance. The solution was to develop the inner capacity to be okay alone, to find in your own company everything you need to be at peace. Not everything you want, everything you need. The desires for company, for love, for friendship are legitimate and human, but the basic needs for emotional well-being shouldn't depend on others. They should have their source inside you, so that when others are present, their presence is an addition to your wholeness, not the requirement for your emotional survival. There's a story about Epictetus that perfectly illustrates his relationship with solitude. When the Emperor Domitian expelled all philosophers from Rome, Epictetus had to leave the city where he taught, the community he'd built, the students with whom he had deep relationships. Overnight, everything external vanished. He went to Nicopolis alone, with nothing but what he carried on him and what he carried inside. Did he collapse? No. He opened a new school. He started over. He built a new community, without bitterness, without resentment, without the emotional devastation that anyone who depended on their surroundings for their inner stability would have experienced. Because his stability didn't depend on his surroundings, it depended on him, on his ability to be alone and be well, on his relationship with himself that no imperial decree could touch. That's the freedom solitude gives you when you embrace it instead of running from it. It doesn't make you cold. It doesn't make you unfeeling. It doesn't make you someone who doesn't need anyone. It makes you someone who doesn't need anyone to be okay, which is radically different. It makes you someone who can love without clinging, who can connect without depending, who can lose without being destroyed, who can be alone and feel peace instead of panic, and who can be with others from the fullness of someone who has themselves, not from the desperation of someone searching for themselves in everyone else. Marcus Aurelius, with all his power, with all his entourage, with all his empire, understood this teaching of Epictetus because he lived it every day. In the middle of thousands of people, he depended only on himself for his inner peace. And that emotional independence was what allowed him to govern without being governed by the need for approval, for company, for external validation. Seneca understood this teaching from the opposite end of the social spectrum. With all his wealth, all his connections, all his prestige, he chose to regularly retreat into solitude because he understood that wealth and constant company can become chains as strong as poverty and isolation if you depend on them for your well-being. And Epictetus, who had neither the power of Marcus Aurelius nor the wealth of Seneca, proved that you don't need either to be free. You only need the ability to be with yourself, to be enough, to find in your inner silence the peace that most people chase in the outer noise without ever finding it. Your assignment for this lesson is to start building your emotional independence from the company of others with a simple but revealing exercise. I want you to identify an activity you normally do with someone else and do it alone. Go eat at a restaurant, go to the movies, walk through a public place, something that normally requires another person's presence for you to feel comfortable doing it. Do it alone, without headphones as a substitute for company, without your phone as a social shield, just you doing that activity in public, without the protective presence of another human being. The discomfort you're going to feel is proportional to your level of dependence. If the discomfort is enormous, the dependence is deep. If it's manageable, you already have some foundation. Either way, every time you do something alone that you'd normally do accompanied, you're expanding your capacity for self-sufficiency. You're proving to yourself that you can, that you don't need anyone to eat, to walk, to exist in a public space, that your own company is enough. And that proof, repeated again and again, builds the internal foundation on which genuine freedom can stand. 10th Stoic lesson. Today you can start turning solitude into your ally, the place where you build yourself in silence so you can shine in the noise. We've reached the last lesson of this episode, and I want you to understand something fundamental before we close. Everything we've worked through today, the fear of silence, the running from yourself, the contamination of the crowd, the difference between company and connection, solitude as a laboratory, emotional dependence, the three questions of self-knowledge, Epictetus's freedom, all of it converges on a single transformation you need to make now. You need to turn solitude from enemy into ally. Until today, solitude has been something you avoid, something you fear, something you associate with failure, with emptiness, with pain, with the unbearable feeling of having no one close. That relationship with solitude has cost you self-knowledge, freedom, genuine relationships, and inner peace. It's kept you running from silence for years, filling every second with noise, settling for company that doesn't nourish you, sacrificing your authenticity to guarantee someone stays close. Starting today, solitude becomes something else. It becomes the place where you build yourself, where you recalibrate, where you process what life throws at you, where you hear your own voice without the interference of 1,000 others, where you practice the most radical honesty that exists, honesty with yourself when nobody is watching. The Stoics didn't just tolerate solitude, they pursued it as a strategic tool for personal construction. They understood something modern culture has forgotten, that what you build in silence has a solidity that what's built in noise can never match, that the person forged in solitude has an inner consistency the person who only exists in company doesn't have, that the clarity that emerges from silence is more reliable than the clarity that seems to emerge from other people's opinions. Think about the most transformative moments in the lives of the three great Stoics. Marcus Aurelius didn't transform at banquets or in Senate meetings. He transformed in the solitude of his tent, writing reflections nobody would read, confronting truths nobody would verify, making promises nobody would supervise. The transformation happened in silence. What the world saw was the result: a just, wise, balanced emperor. But the process, the real work, happened where nobody could see it. Seneca didn't become one of the most influential thinkers in Roman history at Rome's parties. He became that in those voluntary retreats where he processed what he'd lived through, distilled lessons from his experiences, and found the precise words for truths only silence revealed to him. What Rome saw was a brilliant speaker, a prolific writer, a shrewd advisor. But behind that public display were hours upon hours of solitude where the real work was done. Epictetus didn't become the teacher who transformed generations of students in the classroom. He became that in the brutal solitude of slavery, where he had no company but his own thoughts, and where those thoughts, forced by circumstances to operate without external support, developed a depth and clarity no school could have produced. What the world saw was an extraordinary teacher, but the teacher was forged in silence. The pattern is clear. What's built in solitude is what shines in the noise. What's forged in silence is what carries weight when you speak. What you discover about yourself when nobody's watching is what defines how you act when everyone is watching. Solitude is the factory. The world is the showroom. And you've been trying to fill the showroom without ever stepping inside the factory. There's a metaphor I want to leave you with. Think of a tree. What you see of a tree is what's above the ground: the trunk, the branches, the leaves, the fruit. That's the public part. That's what the world sees and admires. But what holds all of that up, what allows the tree to grow tall and bear fruit, what keeps it standing during storms, is beneath the ground. The roots, invisible, silent, working in the dark. No applause, no audience, no one watching them do their essential work. Your solitude is where your roots grow. Every moment of genuine silence, every session of honest reflection, every hour of productive retreat, every time you choose to be with yourself instead of fleeing to the comforting noise of distraction, is a root growing 1 centimeter deeper into the soil of your character. And those roots, completely invisible to the world, invisible even to the people closest to you, are what will determine how tall your tree can grow, how much storm it can withstand before breaking, how much fruit it can bear without collapsing under its own weight. Without deep roots, the most impressive tree, the one with the greenest leaves and the brightest fruit and the tallest branches, falls with the first strong wind. We've all seen it. People who seemed successful, strong, unstoppable, who crumbled at the first serious crisis because beneath all that display there was no depth, no roots, no silent, invisible work of solitude that would have given solidity to everything visible. With deep roots, on the other hand, a modest tree can survive hurricanes. A person with less external shine, but with internal depth, can weather storms that would destroy anyone who only has surface. Your roots are shallow right now. You know it. You feel it. Every time a crisis shakes you more than it should. Every time a setback knocks you down when it should have only made you stumble. Every time you lose your center with an ease that embarrasses you. They're shallow because you've never given them the solitude they need to grow. You've never given them the silence, the fertile darkness, the absence of external stimulation that roots need to go deeper and find water in the lowest layers of the ground. You've been so focused on the visible, so obsessed with the branches and the fruit and the leaves the world sees and applauds, that you completely forgot that all of it depends on something invisible that only grows under the conditions you've avoided most your entire life: solitude and silence. Starting today, solitude stops being the void you fear and becomes the fertile ground where you grow. Not all at once. You don't have to become a monk or a hermit. But you need to incorporate solitude into your life as a regular, deliberate, protected practice, as an investment in your roots that will determine everything your life can produce in the years ahead. Your final assignment for this episode is to design your personal solitude practice. Not a one-time task you do today and forget tomorrow. A system you're going to integrate into your life permanently, the way you integrate physical exercise or nutrition. Because solitude isn't an event, it's a practice. It's a muscle that atrophies if you don't use it and strengthens with every session. I want you to define 3 levels of solitude. First, your daily micro-solitude. 10 minutes every day where you're alone, in absolute silence, with no external stimulus of any kind. No phone, no music, nothing. It can be in the morning before the house wakes up, when the world hasn't started demanding anything from you yet. It can be at night before sleep, when the day is done and you can process it in peace. It can be in your car parked for 5 minutes before walking into work or before walking into your home. The when matters less than the commitment to do it. 10 minutes, every day. No exceptions, no negotiation. It's not optional. It's the minimum maintenance of your relationship with yourself. Second, your weekly retreat. 1 hour per week where you withdraw from the world the way Seneca withdrew from Rome. Your hour of otium. Your hour of mental hygiene, of internal recalibration, of separating what's yours from what belongs to others. An hour where the only company allowed is your own, and the only purpose is to listen to yourself. Protect that hour the way you'd protect a meeting with the most important person in your life. Because it is a meeting with the most important person in your life, you. Third, your monthly deep solitude. 1 afternoon per month, 4 or 5 hours, where you're with yourself asking the big questions that only extended solitude allows you to formulate and answer. Am I living according to my principles? Are my goals still mine? What do I need to adjust? Where am I actually heading? Monthly deep solitude is where the most important harvest happens, where the answers that change the direction of your life emerge. 10 minutes daily, 1 hour weekly, 1 afternoon monthly. That's your solitude system, your investment in roots, your personal laboratory. The place where you build yourself in silence so you can shine with a solidity that only silence can produce. We've reached the end of episode 8. And what we've done today is something most people never do. Look, the silence they've spent their whole life avoiding straight in the face, and discover it's not the enemy they thought it was. It's the ally they always needed, that everything they were searching for outside was waiting for them inside, in a place you can only reach when the noise shuts off and the courage to stay shows up. Let's walk through what we covered today. In the introduction, you understood that the emotional mastery from the previous episode created an internal silence that confronted you with something unexpected, that you don't know how to be with yourself. That the addiction to noise is a cultural dependence that has kept you disconnected from your own truth. That the Stoics saw solitude as a tool of power, not a punishment, and that the inner citadel needs silence to be inhabited. In the first Stoic lesson, you took inventory of a typical day and discovered there isn't a single moment of real silence. That from the moment you wake up to the moment you fall asleep, every second is filled with noise that buries the questions you most need to hear. That Seneca saw the same flight 2,000 years ago with different escape vehicles, and you carved your first pocket of 10 minutes of total silence. In the second Stoic lesson, you confronted the truth about why you run from silence, because in silence, you come face to face with the person who makes you most uncomfortable yourself. You saw that what shows up in silence doesn't disappear in the noise, but ferments and grows like an unpaid debt. That Marcus Aurelius faced his truth every night. That Epictetus taught that freedom begins when you can be with yourself without running, and you named what shows up in your silence. In the third Stoic lesson, Seneca taught you that the crowd corrupts your mental clarity, that every interaction leaves residue of other people's opinions and priorities in your system, that you're living with a borrowed identity made of thoughts that aren't yours. That otium productive retreat is as necessary as negotium, the active life, and you established your first sacred weekly hour of retreat. In the fourth Stoic lesson, you discovered that you confuse being accompanied with being connected, that you can feel lonelier in a crowd than in an empty room. That company without connection is like eating air. That real connection requires vulnerability that terrifies you. That Marcus Aurelius was the most accompanied and most alone man of his time, and that the person who knows how to be alone is the one who best knows how to be with others. You did an inventory of your relationships to separate real connections from empty company. In the fifth Stoic lesson, you transformed your concept of solitude from punishment to laboratory. You understood it's the only space where you discover what you truly think, feel, and want, without interference. That Seneca described retreat as the harvest of a life planted in activity. That Epictetus compared reflection in solitude to digestion, and you entered solitude with a specific question that had been waiting for silence to be answered. In the sixth Stoic lesson, Marcus Aurelius showed you that solitude produces its most powerful fruit, even in the worst circumstances, that the meditations were born in a war zone, not a philosophical spa, that if he found time for solitude while governing an empire, your excuse of not having time isn't valid, and you created your version of the tent, a space and a moment, associated exclusively with taking off the armor. In the seventh Stoic lesson, you faced the emotional dependence on the company of others. You saw that this dependence makes you vulnerable in relationships, decisions, growth, and emotional stability. That Seneca said the wise man is self-sufficient, not because he wants to live without friends, but because he can. That love born from need isn't love, but dependence, with a nice name. And you spent an entire afternoon alone, observing your discomfort and finding the calm that comes after. In the eighth Stoic lesson, you asked yourself the three questions that define real self-knowledge: who you are when nobody's watching, what you think when nobody's listening, what you want when nobody's influencing you. You saw that the distance between your public self and your private self is the measure of your integrity, that your censored thoughts govern you if you don't examine them, that your desires may not be yours if you never question them in solitude, and you answered all three questions with the honesty that only silence allows. In the ninth Stoic lesson, Epictetus taught you from his experience as a slave and a free man in poverty that true freedom is the ability to be enough for yourself. That, depending on company, is a form of invisible slavery. That the person who doesn't need anyone to be okay can love without clinging and connect without depending. And you did an activity in public completely alone to expand your capacity for self-sufficiency. And in the 10th Stoic lesson, you understood that what's built in silence is what shines in the noise. That solitude is where the invisible roots grow that hold up everything visible. And you designed your solitude system: 10 minutes daily, 1 hour weekly, 1 afternoon monthly, your permanent investment in the roots that will support everything you build from here on out. If this episode changed your relationship with solitude, if silence stopped being your enemy and started being your ally, leave this phrase in the comments: Today I choose to be with myself. Share this episode with someone who runs from silence, someone who can't go 5 minutes without their phone, someone who fills every moment with noise because they're terrified of what they'd find if they held still, someone who needs to hear that solitude is not emptiness, it's fullness waiting to be discovered. And practice. The solitude system you designed doesn't work if it stays on paper. It works when you sit in silence tomorrow morning and discover that, for the first time in a long time, you don't need to run from yourself. Now, I need to prepare you for what's coming, because solitude is going to reveal something to you that needs protection. Something that, if you don't actively protect it, the people around you are going to destroy without you even realizing it's happening. In solitude, you discovered who you truly are. You discovered what you think, what you feel, what you want, without other people's influence. You found your voice, your truth, your center. That's extraordinary. It's the most important work you've done in 8 episodes. But now you have to go back into the world. And the world is full of people who are going to try to move you off that center, who are going to cross your boundaries, who are going to invade your space, who are going to demand your time, your energy, your attention, regardless of what you need. People who are going to try to redefine who you are to suit their convenience, who are going to pressure you to go back to being the old you, the one with no boundaries, the one who said yes to everything, the one who sacrificed for everyone except himself. Episode 9 is called Until You Set Boundaries, They'll Keep Walking All Over Your Life. And it's going to teach you the hardest and most necessary skill that exists for protecting everything you've built. These 8 episodes of inner work, the ability to say no, to set boundaries that are clear, firm, non-negotiable, without guilt and without apology, to protect your space, your time, your energy, and your truth from the people who, with good intentions or bad, consciously or unconsciously, are going to try to invade them, because that's what they've always done, and because you've always let them. The Stoics understood that it's not enough to build yourself internally if you don't protect what you've built. That the inner citadel needs walls. That the clarity you found in silence needs guards to keep other people's noise from contaminating it again. That all the work of self-knowledge, of emotional mastery, of productive solitude can be eroded in weeks if you let anyone cross your boundaries whenever they please. Now that you know how to be alone, now that you don't depend on others to feel complete, now that your emotional well-being has its source inside you and not in the presence of others, you can set boundaries without the fear that used to paralyze you. Before, setting a boundary meant risking the company you desperately needed. Every no was a risk of abandonment. Every boundary was a threat to your emotional lifeline. Now, setting a boundary is simply protecting something worth more than any company, your relationship with yourself. The relationship you built in the silence of these 8 episodes, and that deserves to be protected with the firmness the Stoics taught. This is Stoicism for winners. This is From Lost to Unstoppable. Today you learn to be with yourself in silence. Tomorrow you're going to learn to protect that silence from a world that wants to fill it with its noise. See you in episode 9. With deeper roots, with solitude turned into an ally, and with the urgent need to learn the most powerful and most difficult word that exists, no. Your voice matters here more than you think. Every insight you share strengthens and elevates this community, because this isn't just another space. It's a circle of people who choose to live with intention, with discipline, and with character. Each of you leaves a mark, and the reflection that receives the most support will be pinned as a banner of who we are. Not as decoration, but as a reminder of the kind of warrior who chooses to think, feel, and act with Stoic clarity. Because this is a community that doesn't run from pain, it walks through it with courage. A community that doesn't look for cheap comfort, it seeks wisdom. A community that doesn't break under adversity, it turns it into strength. And if you've made it this far, it's because something inside you is already shifting. Something is waking up. Something is asking for more. So, before you leave, check the description. There you'll find the paths we created to help you keep strengthening your mind. They're not there by accident. Each one exists to help you go deeper, build inner resilience, and return again and again to that place within you where nothing and no one can take your peace. Subscribing isn't doing the podcast a favor. It's an act of respect toward yourself. It's choosing not to live on autopilot anymore. It's committing to think differently, to feel with more order, to live with more intention. Because every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we publish reflections designed to stay with you when life gets heavy, when your mind gets loud, when you need a reminder of who you are. Not following us means risking missing the one lesson you might need in the hardest moment. And if you choose to go a step further, if you choose to become a member, understand one thing clearly. You're not donating, you're sustaining a mission. Because of you, this flame stays alive. Because of you, we can keep spreading Stoicism as a refuge for millions who are fighting not to give up. Your support is what keeps this podcast alive, strong, and growing. You're not a spectator, you're part of the foundation holding this community together. I'll see you in our next Stoicism for Winners session, where we'll keep exploring the depth of Stoic wisdom applied to everyday life. In the meantime, dive into the recommended sessions in the description and continue your path. And until we cross paths again, don't forget this. You are the master of your perception, the guardian of your peace, and the warrior of your own battle. That is the legacy of Stoicism. That is the art of becoming invincible.